in this text, and there's some things in here that the Lord just won't allow me to get away from. First of all, last week we were talking about double for your trouble. Look at somebody, tell them double for your trouble. Double for your trouble. And we saw that Job got double for his trouble. He started out with 7,000 oxen, and he ended up with 14,000. 7,000 sheep, 14,000. He started out with 3,000 cattle, ended up with 6,500 yoke of oxen, ended up with 1,000. And he started out with 500 donkeys, ended up with 1,000 donkeys. And we found out that if you hang in there with God, he'll give you double for your trouble. Anybody glad about the double for your trouble? But then there was somebody else that kind of stood out to me there. Somebody else that stood out to me that I can't get them out of my head. And it's a prophet by the name of Elijah, the prophet of power. If you remember, Elijah was the one who showed up with Moses at the transfiguration when Jesus was on the mountain. And Peter, James, and John were there. And Peter said, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for me, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Elijah is a prophet of power, but his humanity, much like Peter in the Old New Testament, God shows us a great deal about this man's humanity. And we talk about it in chapter 17, how he came out of nowhere, just came out of nowhere on a mission for God. And we found out that God will take care of him. You remember he went down to the widow's woman's house and he pulled out the barrel and shows you that if you're hanging there with God, not only will God give you a barrel of blessing, but God will keep filling up the barrel. Anybody need a barrel of blessing? Then we went to chapter 18. We went to chapter 18. And we saw in chapter 18 how he stood up on Mount Carmel against the 450 prophets of Baal. And God gave him the victory. He was outnumbered. But how many of you know this morning? I don't care how many people on the other side. If God is with you, he's more than the whole world against you. Anybody hearing me? One man against 450. It tells us that there will come some times in your life when you got to take a stand. You got to make a stand for Jesus. You got to do like Donnie McClurkin had said, when there's nothing else to do, stand. When you can't go to anybody else, stand. When everybody turns against you, stand. When nobody will stand with you, stand. When your wife walk out on you, stand. When your husband leaves you, stand. When you lose your job, stand. Anybody found out God will stand with you? So Elijah stood in chapter 19. We saw Elijah down in depression and reminds us that Christians can have bad days too. Look at somebody tell them I've had some. Christians can have some bad days too. As a matter of fact, he had a real bad day. But he has sense enough to know that when you're having a bad day, that's the day you need to run to Jesus. Anybody glad about it this morning? And so he ran to the Lord and he stood out in the cave. Fire, wind blew and broke up the rocks. The earthquake shook the side of the mountain. The fire was blazing on the mountaintop. But God was not in the wind. God was not in the earthquake. And God was not in the fire. But then God came in a still small voice and said, Elijah, Elijah, isn't it good to know that when you need help, God knows just what you need? The word small means gentle. God came to him in a gentle voice. He didn't need to come in and fussing. He didn't need to come arguing. He didn't need to come reprimanding. Don't you just get perturbed with folk when they come to you and you've been in trouble and they trying to tell you what the problem is, like you stupid and don't know what the problem is. You already know what the problem is. You just need somebody that'll come and pray with you. Somebody that'll just believe in you. Somebody that'll just stand with you. Somebody that'll just encourage you and tell you everything is going to work out. Put it in the Lord's hand. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And so Elijah, if you remember, he left that mountain. He went up the mountain in discouraged, but he came down the side of the mountain encouraged because he had spent some time with God. That's what ought to happen when you come to church. You might come in with a load on you, but when you leave, the load ought to be just a little bit lighter. You ought to hear something that'll tell you that no matter what you're struggling with, Jesus is the answer. And I found out that not only is the answer, but he will make a way. Look at somebody, tell him he'll do it. And so Elijah went back down the mountaintop with a mission. He went up discouraged. He left. 20 more years is a ministry upon him. And so we leave him down the side of the mountain over the mission. God told them to go anoint 3 people. Anoint a prophet by the name of Elijah. Anoint Hazael to be the king of Syria. Anoint Jehu to be king of Israel. And then I want you to anoint Elisha to be the prophet in your room. And so what he does, he goes down the mountainside and he takes his mantle. His mantle is the cloak that he wears. But the cloak that the prophet is wearing is symbolic of his prophetic authority. It is much like the rod that Moses had in his hand. When Moses stood at the Red Sea and pointed the rod out, it was not that the rod was powerful, but the rod represented the authority of God that had been delegated to Moses. So when Moses stretched out the rod, the waters parted. They banked up on both sides, and east wind came